Hello. Okay. So, where to begin? If you haven't been to the channel before, this is TH Paul, that's me. Vulture X21 is the other handle that I go by on the internet. And I write fantasy novels, and I'm going to be live reading the second book of the series, which I have right here. This is a proof copy, but it is available on Amazon, or you can directly message me for a copy. This is Legacy Chronicle, The Shield. These go for about $20. If you buy it with the first one, you get both for $35. They're available on Amazon, but I sell them directly, and I will sign them. A couple things. So that's just a general update for some people who might be new about what this is and what I'm going to be doing. I will be reading chapter, including the prologue today, trying to keep it around between 30 to 50 pages every time I do a reading, and readings should be on Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, always at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, to try to uniformly get those out. So if you miss a reading and you want to catch up with the story, you can do so through the YouTube channel, which is under the same handle as this Twitch channel, which is Vulture X21. So there's lots of ways to keep up with the book. And if you missed the first reading and you want to catch up, you can go back to the YouTube channel. The entire first book is up there, live read by me. Now, the reason that the live readings were started was because people who were buying the books wanted to do audiobooks, but we didn't have the ability, because this is a independently published novel, to do audio because it's actually fairly tricky. You need professional people to do it, you need the equipment, etc. Well, excitingly now, we have someone to do audiobooks, and this summer we're going to release, ideally at the end of the summer, depending on how long it takes. It's a new thing for us, so we don't really know how well it's going to go, but I'm going to work with Tynan Collins, who's a local voice actor reader and is excited to be doing this, and I'm going to be giving him a short story based on the Legacy Chronicles series that he will produce. That'll probably be around, for me, 30 to 40 pages, and give or take like a half an hour to an hour of story content that will be related to, but not directly from book 1 or book 2. And then we will release that through Audible on Amazon for a reasonable price, maybe $1. Just to give you an idea of what the audio is going to sound like with him as a reader, and to let him get his feet wet with reading these stories and kind of getting a feel for the process and everything. So that'll be the first part, and that's sort of like to whet your appetite until the entire first book gets done. It's going to take him a while to do it, and that's totally fine. We want it to be done well. As far as book 3 goes, for people who have read the first 2 and are waiting on book 3, best update I can give you right now is that I am, I would say, 75% of the way through the first draft of it. So by the end of the summer, I would ideally have the first draft through, and I would start the process of editing it thoroughly with my wife, and also, hopefully, after a couple of run-throughs of that, going to Wes, who some of you know has done a lot of work with me in the past, and getting a little more feedback there. By the spring of next year, so 2020, hopefully that book will be close to being ready to be published. But I'm not going to set a hard date yet until I get the first draft done, work through it, and have some time to sit on it. But for people who are wondering, that's where it's at. So, I have been very sick for a couple of, about a week. So I held off on doing my initial first reading, which was going to be on Sunday, because I was still recovering. My voice is still not great. So I'm going to do my best to get through here, but I have a lot of water and I'm probably going to use it. So we're going to pick up with book 2 by reading what comes at the very beginning of the book, and I will show you. For those who are still unsure about purchasing or following up the series, every book comes with our story so far section at the beginning, right with the map. And it's about 3 pages, and it essentially recaps what's happened in the story so far. Because as you can see, this book is pretty substantial in length. This one is 540 pages. The first one is a little over 500 pages. And these are dense pages of text. So, you know, we don't want people to feel like they fell behind. And obviously, I was reading book 1 last summer, so it's been a while since you've probably heard some of that. That is if this is how you're keeping up with the story itself. So, we'll start with our story so far. In Book 1, which is called The Sword. An unknown figure is introduced at the end of the Four Winds in Gailakill, and he is asked to tell his famous story by several children. First he speaks of a great meeting between immortal gods, where they debate whether to intervene in the lives of mortals. He then refers to events from the War of the Lion, an invasion of the continent Lagotia by a massive imperial army from the west that tried to destroy the Order of the Eagle Knights. A young half-elf by the name of Trim Waterhound served legendary Eagle Knight commander Bullwife Margrave in the battle and met an infamous figure, Vakhtyn el-Vak, whose name became synonymous with betrayal after the war ended. The story then jumps forward many years, and Trim Waterhound, seemingly still as young as he was while at Aves, finds the unconscious body of another half-elf named Javanleth Blade in the woods of Silverleaf. Nursing the other man back to health, Trim learns he is in search of his father, and after encountering the spirit of a powerful elven druid while hunting, Trim chooses to assist Jovan in his search. The two half-elves set off for Gailakill, a trade town at the center of the Dust Plains, but Javanleth can tell both from Trim's odd behavior and his secretive nature that there is something significant Jovan does not know about his companion. In the meantime, a massive invasion of the Napoleon Empire, a northern conglomeration of noble houses under a single High Thane, has led to their subjugation by the servants of Naroth, the god of death. The leader of this army, Wolfbane, aims to conquer the entire continent of Lagotia and bring it under one ruler for Naroth, eventually aiming to unite all of mortal kind under the god of death's banner. To do so, Wolfbane has been given the assistance of a powerful ancient wizard, Dearvaron, whose unnaturally prolonged life has made him a master of arcane magic. In theory, Dearvaron works with Wolfbane as an equal servant to Naroth, but the wizard's meetings with the god of death imply he is less than subservient to the deity. To assist the Narothian army, Dearvaron uses his dark arts to construct an impenetrable fortress at the entrance to the Cloud Peak Basin, where the righteous nation of Angladeus can be found. By doing so, he and Wolfbane have cut off the greatest potential threat to the Narothians, while they cede to the conquest of lesser powers in Lagotia. Having turned several Napoleon Thanes to his side during his war in the north, Wolfbane forms a council of lieutenants to oversee his grand campaign and begins plotting next steps. But Edwulf el-Vak, one of Wolfbane's council members and his adopted son, believes his hero has lost his way. Edge escapes Nepal City with Raymir Squall, daughter of Greymane Squall, a Thane who betrayed his people to Wolfbane's army and had most of his family murdered in front of him by Wolfbane's servants. Edge tries to get clear of the Narothian-held land so the two lovers can settle somewhere in peace. With the assistance of Romand, a spy in Nepal City Castle, they manage to make their way northward to Raymir's ancestral home, pursued by another of Wolfbane's lieutenants, a sickly wizard named Saltillion. There, Edge learns from Raymir's grandfather, Algathor Squall, that his name, el-Vak, is considered a curse by many because of the actions Vakhtyn took during the War of the Lion. Trim and Jovan reach Gailakill and encounter a vast number of refugees fleeing raids from the broken bandits and cutthroats that were once members of the Empire of the Lion, left behind after they failed to conquer Aves and the Eagle Knights so many years before. The broken are now fighting for the Narothians and under the banner of one leader possessing huge numbers and with ranks bolstered by vicious wolf-like monsters called gnolls. Trim insists he and Jovan learn what they can and leave the town in search of Javanleth's father, but the inn they are staying at is attacked by cloaked and unnatural foes seeking another man. Trim, Jovan, and a number of others present when the attack begins leap to help the man named Ghost, who is the target of the monsters. In the fight, Trim's sword is shown to have magical powers, being able to burn with flames when a command word is spoken. Together, the group decides to follow Ghost east in search of an item he desperately needs to turn the tide of the war with Wolfbane and the Narothians. He promises to help Jovan's father if he and Trim will help Ghost first, and the others choose to join for their own reasons. Logan Angladeus, a knight and prince from Angladeus, and Grimtooth, his blood brother and an orc, are simply looking to do some good in the world and believe aiding Ghost will be a noble act. Diaga Cursair, a wizard, and his companion Neep, a firecat, go along in search of adventure. Together they move eastward, hoping to find a road south through the Silverleaf that is still usable, and encounter a talkative halfling named Gend and his black-clad companion Wrath. The two travelers say they know a passage south and will avoid the dangerous and slow trek through Silverleaf Forest. Deciding to take them with them, Trim and company continue on towards the town of Delmore. In Alderlast, capital of Angladeus, King Arvadas Angladeus, Logan's father, is being challenged by an opposition faction in his nation led by High Lord Carcyrus Vendile. With his failure to destroy the magically created fortress blocking egress from the Cloud Peak Basin, Arvadas is losing authority to Vendile and his alliance with the High Lords Hlodic and Bwemmer. Since Hlodic controls the priests and Bwemmer the army, Arvadas is having a difficult time effectively fighting the enemy in the fortress. Vendile, with the help of his odd advisor Freyn, is eventually able to force a vote among the High Lords and have Arvadas imprisoned along with his allies Irindian and Calavar. Thrown in the dungeons, they are left to wait for sentencing while Vendile takes the throne of Angladaeus for himself. Wolfbane sends Valissa Ulfrin and Hrothgar Conan, two Napoleon Thanes who betrayed their people and sided with the Nerathians south to take charge of the Broken Army's conquest of that region. In the meantime, Edge and Raymir evade Saltilian and Glaciar, but Raymir's grandfather Algathor is killed protecting them. Together with Roman, they enter the mountains in search of a place called Twisted Spire, where Raymir believes a powerful weapon is being forged for Nerathian armies. Unknown to them, Saltilian pursues them, his madness growing as he has convinced himself he will kill Edge and force Raymir to fall in love with him once her beloved is dead. Trem and the others with him reach Delmore, where a number of shocking revelations occur. It is revealed that Ghost is in fact Greymane Squall, the traitor of Nepal who seeks revenge on Wolfbane for the deaths of his family. Additionally, Trem encounters an old man named Joseph, who begs Trem to stay and defend the town, which is about to be attacked by the Broken Army, saying Trem once helped him in a similar way long ago. This exposes Trem's secret. He has been given a piece of godly power by Curvin, the god of time, and does not age, explaining how he could have been at Aves during the War of the Lion. Trem is revealed then to be over 50 years old, though he looks to be only in his late teens. Trem is clearly unnerved by meeting Joseph once more, but the impending attack forces a decision. Ghost insists it is not their fight, and that they should move on, leaving Delmore and her people to their fate. Javanaleth, wanting to help the panicked people of Delmore, stays, expecting Trem to do so as well, but Ghost convinces Trem to go with him. Together with Wrath and Gend, Ghost and Trem abandon the town and go south toward the passage Gend has told them of, and Javanaleth is left behind, angry and confused. The broken assault Delmore, now led by Hrothgar and Valissa, but commanded primarily by Goranath, a bloodthirsty broken warrior who united his people, and Goranath's ally Gren, a massive bronze-skinned gnoll. The townspeople are fleeing Delmore as fast as they can, while Logan, Grimtooth, Jovan, Joseph, Diaga, and Neat rally many to hold off the attack. They are able to get most of the people away and moving south, but Jovan is trapped in the town with a badly wounded Joseph, surrounded by broken and gnolls. Suddenly, Trem arrives and rescues Jovan, Trem in turn being rescued by Ghost, and they all manage to escape southward. Joseph succumbs to his wounds and dies in the way, and the party must defend the refugees of Delmore against the cloaked monsters that attacked them at the inn in Gylokill. They manage to defeat them temporarily, and enter the underground passage of Chronocarl to Southrun, where Ghost believes they can find information on an item that will give him a chance to add his revenge. Meanwhile, in Angladaeus, Arvadis' eldest son, Varasho, launches a daring rescue mission with the help of his brother Logan's lover, Lena Engrove, and a sympathetic soldier named Renan Ordlan. They manage to sneak into the dungeons and free the 3 prisoners, but have to leave them using a different and more dangerous path that takes them through the Cavern of the Ancients. There, Arvadis makes a bargain with the fearsome creatures to gain safe passage, also managing to recover a rare sword in the process. Once safely outside, they begin planning to retake the throne from Carcyrus Vendile. Inside the passage of Chronocarl, Trem tells the others of his past, explaining his magical sword once belonged to the traitor Vakhtyn Elvak, and that Trem is the unknown soldier who killed Vakhtyn during the War of the Lion, avenging the latter's murder of Ave's commander, Bullwife Margrave. Gend then leads them to Sunhall, a dwarven town in the caves. Trem is brought to meet the Dwarven king, but it is soon revealed that this is a trap. Gend is working in service to Balthazane, the god of betrayal and son of Nerath, and Gend has brought Trem to Sunhall to be killed. Diaga sees through the illusion around the doors, recognizing that they are shape-shifting slits, and the others manage to escape as the cavern starts to cave in. Trem is unable to escape, having been wounded severely by Gend, but Wrath appears and rescues the half-elf, killing the halfling traitor in the process. Wrath desperately tries to get them both clear of the collapsing cavern before they are trapped forever. In Alderlast, Arvadis and his allies manage to rally the people of the nation's capital and march on the palace. There they confront Vendile at his coronation, but he will not surrender and a fight breaks out. Several people are wounded or killed, and Arvadis chases Vendile into the palace with Calavar, Lena, and Varasho. Vendile watches his advisor, Freyan, desert him by changing into a raven and flying away. Lena then corners Vendile, but she is murdered by him when she becomes distracted. In a fit of rage and sadness, Varasho bashes Vendile's head in with his staff, ending the fighting once and for all. Later, Varasho sees Lena's ghost in his family's home while trying to drink away the memory of his failure to protect her, and it seems to bring him some peace. To the north, Edge, Romand, and Raymir are attacked by a demonic wolf summoned by Saltilian. They defeat the beast and continue toward the high peak of Mount Iceblade, hoping to spot Twisted Spire from there with Romand's spyglass. They reach the peak and successfully find the tower in the distance, but Saltilian surprises them, mortally wounding Romand when he tries to protect Edge. Edge is able to kill Saltilian, and before he dies, Romand reveals he is, in reality, Jonathan Blade, leader of the Order of the Blade and Javanaleth's father. Raymir and Edge decide to continue on to Twisted Spire before bringing news of Jonathan's death to his people. The refugees from Delmore and their saviors escape the caverns, but the cave-in appears to seal Trem, Gend, and Wrath inside. Later that evening, Wrath burrows free and is rescued by Javanaleth, Kaliandra, and Diaga, then telling them the truth again is trickery. They also learn that Wrath was sent from Ulinar, the mighty main city of the Dominion of Malaria, to assassinate Trem, as a prophecy says Trem will bring doom to Ulinar if he lives long enough. However, Wrath chose not to kill Trem after he went back for Joven and the others at Delmore. Wrath says he will take them all to Ulinar, home of the Malarians, where they can find someone to heal Trem of his grievous wounds. Trem dreams while he is unconscious and encounters Balthazane. He learns that Balthazane's father, Narath, wants to unite the mortals against a deadlier threat, and Balthazane insists that Trem does not understand the danger the mortal and immortal worlds are truly in. Trem discounts him and banishes Balthazane from his dreams, demonstrating his growing power. In an unnerving scene, Deavron is visited in his dungeon laboratory by Freyne with a strange book, which promises to offer the Dread Wizard new and terrible powers, greater than any he has had before. So that is the intro. I'm going to take a drink and then we'll get to Prologue. Okay. And I may have to stop between each section just because my voice is still not quite up to par. So, Prologue. The winter gusts had died down somewhat in the past few days, and the master of the Inn of the Four Winds was thankful for the respite from the biting shrieks that slipped through the few cracks in its walls. Had it been even a hair warmer, he would have taken his mother's old bucket of patch and gone out to fill the holes, but the cold was such he would never find the culprits in time to seal them before the material was too hard to spread. He sighed as he rinsed wooden and pewter mugs at one end of the long bar. How his mother had kept the inn going after his father passed had always baffled him, and now that he was the sole proprietor, he found the task nearly impossible. The heavy tread of the inn stairs brought him out of his musings as he set the mug down, knowing full well that who was coming into the common room. It was late morning, and he would have expected his lone guest to have risen sooner, but each day it seemed he lost a bit more daylight in his room. There was no reason to complain, though, since the great man's presence had brought patrons in each evening to hear his tale, originally requested by the young children of Garlic-Hill. Setting his endless washing aside for now, the innkeeper wiped his hands on a worn cloth and moved around the bar to greet his auspicious guest. When he had first arrived, the man had possessed a thin layer of scraggly dark hair about his chin and jaw, peppered with the gray that flowed long and loose atop his head. In the past week, it seemed he had neglected his razor, and he now had an even more haggard appearance brought about by his lengthening facial hair. His dark eyes shone even in the worn face as he rounded the bottom step and met those of his host. There was no smile on his face, but he nodded respectfully and said, "Could you spare the time to make some tea? A darker leaf, if you have it." "Of course, my lord." "Don't call me that." It was spoken with a tired routine, as though it was a phrase oft repeated and never respected. Settling onto his stool, the guest looked about the empty inn and said nothing, while the innkeeper made himself busy brewing a pot of the requested beverage. When it was ready, he came over with a heavy iron kettle and carefully removed the top, dipping the steel sieve, holding the loose leaves a few times to ensure the concoction was as strong as his guest liked. As he went to replace the lid, the old man's hand came up and he said, "Darker varieties are better left to steep in the open air, if you don't mind." "Not at all." The innkeeper set the top aside on the slate tile behind the bar top and pulled two small cups with delicate handles from behind the bar. "May I join you again, my lord?" "I've told you time and again, Hal, you're always welcome to sit and indulge with me. It makes a man less lonely, if nothing else." Taking the hint, Hal, that was the innkeeper's name, poured each a small cup and sat with his hands hovering about his vessel, letting the heat warm them. They did not speak for a while, the proprietor having caught the hint in his guest's proverb, but Hal had something he felt he must say, even if he knew it was not his place. And yet in the presence of this man whom he knew so well, while somehow still knowing nothing of him at all, he felt he could not say it. As his guest sipped from his cup gently, he seemed to read Hal's mind. "What troubles you? I've seen you watching me even when the common room is full of irregulars, and I know it's not from fear or suspicion that you pay me more attention than most." The innkeeper was slightly taken aback, but simultaneously relieved to have an opening. He set his own cup down and rubbed his hands before saying, "It's not that I don't enjoy having you here. You're an honored guest, of course, but I mean, should you not be back west?" Sensing he had been too accusatory in his inquiry, Howell tried to backpedal. "What I mean, sir, is that while you've brought much interest to the inn and enchanted our town through tales, it seems odd you stay here, alone, when you must have other duties elsewhere." There was no response, and the innkeeper was worried he had truly offended his guest, but then he took a slow sip of his tea and turned, a small cup in one hand, to look over his shoulder at the lone door to the main room of the inn. He seemed to linger on it, as though waiting for it to open, but he turned back and his face betrayed the truth. He knew he was waiting in vain. With a gentle pat on Hal's hand, which surprised the master at the Inn of the Four Winds, his guest said, There are those who can manage my affairs while I'm away. I just wish to wait here, for a time, and see if an old friend will return. Once again he took a drink from his cup and held it out for Howell to refill. And I've begun my tale, but it's far from finished. It would be wrong to leave without telling the whole story. Of course, Hal said in agreement, sipping his own cup. You'll be our resident bard again tonight, then? That brought a chuckle from his guest. I'm not deserving of the title, but I suppose you could say that. Then his face grew sad, and he said far more quietly, though I fear there is little joy in what I will bring to light this evening, or for many evenings to come. Howell, unsure how to respond, refilled both cups and settled against the support beam behind the bar with his in hand. The two did not speak for the next hour or so, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, and the whistle of it through the narrow cracks in the walls gave the end of the four winds a voice all its own. As the afternoon came on, some of the locals began to filter in for food or drink, while the guest retired to his room once again to conduct whatever business he might have there in private. By the time dusk fell, he was coming down the stairs once more, a gathered crowd awaiting the next part of his story. Within the darkened chamber, Naroth sat solemnly at a modest desk. Turning the pages of a small, expertly bound book, he reviewed his most recent entry before dipping his quill and marking the date behind the last name. Another day on Tethtanir had passed on, and another host of souls had traversed the mysterious pathway from mortality into the realm of their creators. All would meet with the Dark Father as they crossed over, and then proceed to the Dead Realms, or pass on to the plane that was ruled by the deity they had ardently worshipped. Some never quite understood what happened, unaware they had died, and curious as to where they were going. For them, Naroth would reach into their minds and pull forth memories of contentment and happiness before using them to recreate a pocket in the infinite space of the Dead Realms that would leave the newly deceased at peace. It was his most solemn duty, and one he had not neglected even as he turned his mind towards the greater threats swirling about both the immortals and those on Tethtanir. Naroth slowly placed the quill on his desk and capped his inkpot. He glanced last time at his spidery handwriting and closed the tome. No matter the number of names he had catalogued, the book never grew in size, appearing as little more than a thin ledger, but it always had as many pages as necessary to accommodate each passing. So many things in his home were controlled by restraints that were illusions, set in place by Naroth and accepted by him once they were. If there was a fear that he possessed, it was the enormity of the power he commanded and what other, far more incomprehensible forces must exist outside his own. He glanced up from the desk and gave his simply adorned room a cursory study, finding it soothed him. There were boundaries here. It was no matter if they were creations of his mind. He could feel them, and it calmed him. Rising from his desk, the god of death walked slowly past his canopy bed, a luxury he had never used for its intended purpose. Not needing sleep or rest, he had created it for his room because mortals kept them, and, despite his frustrations with those on Tethtanir, he felt a strong connection to those he believed were, in some way, his children. That so many had turned away from him and his fellow immortals, or even worse, forgotten their existence entirely, was a source of terrible discomfort for him. His one-time wife believed that the mortals should be allowed to move onward without the gods, to stay as close or distant from their creators as they wanted. The idea was abhorrent to him. He had been made to guide and protect not only the mortal races, but all the sphere of Tethtanir and the godly realms. His duty was to both worlds, immortal and mortal alike, and those who existed in those places must give reference to the task Naroth had shouldered. The mortals had to be quelled and controlled, united against a doom they could not imagine or detect, but one Naroth had seen and lived and knew all too well was real and, he feared, closing in on him. As he brushed his pale hand across the satin of his bedding, the god reflected solemnly on his methods. To be certain, in order to regain control over the mortals, he had resorted to brutality, and his true children, those he'd made with the love of Alanormir, had suffered for it. Xanaroth and Balthazane particularly had been tormented. Each had lost their realm of influence as mortality delved into darker and more divisive elements of their being. Naroth knew his sons despised the mortals for what they felt they had done to them, but Naroth also knew such vices existed in the gods as well. Perhaps it had been foolish to believe that the immortals could come to represent only the virtuous ideals of their kind. Indeed, Naroth had seen how twisted even the most noble of the deities had become. And had he not become twisted himself, mortals had always feared him, even his servants, for he represented the great end they all must face. Naroth had never begrudged them their fear, for he himself was afraid of his own demise, nigh impossible as such an event might be. Yet even with their distrust of him, Naroth had always seen himself as the mortal's guide and solemn protector. But many of the names in his book, those he wrote down each day, came to him on the blades of swords he himself had set against them. Naroth was employing brutality to bring mortality to heel, using the skills of dread servants like Dearveron, who he knew to be malicious and indifferent to the plight of their fellow men and women. He had summoned the dark anger and hatred of the Night Cloaks to do his bidding, knowing full well what blasphemy it was to call upon them at all. And now he was using Galaron, his own brother, to empower a mortal champion that would ensure his victory. Not for the first time, he wondered if the ends justified his means. Walking to the balcony of his chambers, Narath listened to the gentle swish of his cloak against the marble floor. Resting his hands on the stone railing of his curving black rock balcony, Narath bowed his head in thought. He could feel the swirling powers all about his realm, even the weak efforts of Galaron to break free of his imprisonment. Narath hoped his brother would forgive him when it was all over. He hoped that Galaron would see that Narath had done what had to be done, but he knew already that he had shattered their bond. Soon it would not matter. He'd found a man who would be his instrument of conquest, and he had the descended immortal in his grasp. Now he only had to be patient and allow events to run their course. Yet the assurance that his plans had been set did not ease the wrenching forces in his own mind, ever pulling on strings of self-doubt. "You can feel it too, my husband." Her voice still stirred his soul into a maelstrom. Narath did not know if they had been made to affect each other so, or if, out of the myriad of all possible gods that might have formed at the very beginning of all things, their devotion to one another had merely been the strongest, and thus pushed them together, the greatest of their kind. Either way, she was still the only thing that could hurt him, because he loved her so, though he'd never admit it. "You have no husband, goddess of life." Her sigh was soft, but he heard it drift towards him. Turning from the balcony, he looked in her unforgettable presence. He took in her unforgettable presence. Her hair hung golden from the crown it far outshone, framing a wise but youthful face of solemnity. How starkly they contrasted in all ways, and once again he wondered, how had they ever been drawn together? Narath stepped into the room and turned to his right, lifting a glass and small decanter of wine from the cabinet beside the balcony entrance. "Intrusion aside, I can't help but be hospitable. A draught of wine, my lady." "Thank you." Eleanor accepted the drink without taking her eyes off Narath. Holding it at her chest, she spoke to him as he poured himself one. "You're killing him, you know." Narath sipped his own drink and closed the cabinet. "I will not kill him. Galaron is strong, and even his efforts to break free cannot do more than exhaust him. Tell me, where does our brother Galaron reside in your dark home?" Narath chuckled softly. "I gave him quarters of his own and had Xanaroth transport some of his personal things here. He cannot leave, but that does not mean he should not be comfortable. Despite your assurances, rumors passing between our domains tell me he is dying. Galaron is not in his own plane, and what's more, he seems stricken with a broken heart. I do not know what you're demanding of him, but you must realize what this imprisonment is doing to him. Let him go, Narath." The god of death kept his outward countenance impassive, but he was certain Eleanor could sense his internal doubts. "I will not allow him to come to harm. I'm not like my more murderous fellows." The words stung, as he knew they would. He heard the glass break in her hand as she tightened her grip so much that it crushed the thin material. Narath set his own down and reached out for her bloody fingers. Eleanor looked down at the shards and crimson stains, ignoring his gesture. "We have all done things we regret. You cannot live in denial of your past. You must accept it and determine what is to become of your future." Narath took her hand in his, and the cut slowly closed, the blood disappearing as he held his free hand aloft, pulling the broken glass together and reforming the vessel before setting it delicately back in the cupboard. "I promise you that I will keep Galaron well. Is that all you came to speak to me about?" The goddess of life held her hand before her eyes and spoke quietly. "Such delicate, loving touch you have when you want to. I never wished to leave you, despite our differences. You chose to cut yourself off from us. I would do it again. It was the fate you deserved." Eleanor said nothing at first, then turned to look out over the balcony and spoke sternly. "The absence of Galaron is leading to a significant rise in unraveling among the mortals. Mages studying to be masters of the arcane and those unaware of their affinity for it alike are having themselves torn asunder in greater rates than ever before. I doubt you have seen any cross into your domain. Most have been completely unmade. None, not even our kind, know what happens to them once the horrors of the unraveling take them." "You know I regret this," Narath said coolly, "but it must be so. Prices must be paid by some to save all others." "Then you should pay that price yourself." Eleanor snapped at him, hot anger in her eyes. "I could say the same for you, my former love." There was a long, tense pause as both considered one another, a torrent of emotions flowing between them. Eleanor looked into Narath's black eyes at last and whispered, "It remains as it has always been. One of us will perish." Narath stared back coldly. There is no other way. He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned away, walking back to the cabinet and pouring another glass of wine, turning it over carefully in his hands. "It has always amazed me, given the annals of our kind's history, that you willingly enter my realm where I could destroy you utterly if I wished." Eleanor rested her hands at her sides. "You would never." "You're right. I could not harm you. I wish I could say I would believe you if you told me the same." There was no response. Narath waited a few moments, then turned around to see Eleanormere had gone. His shoulders slumped as he relaxed, a great tension released from him. In a sudden rush of fury at himself or Eleanormere he could not say, Narath hurled his wineglass to the floor, the shattering crystalline fragments spreading across the tiles as dark red streams of wine splashed all around. He stared at the mess before him, considering the shape it made, knowing how easy it would be to wave his hand or even a finger and have it all disappear. Narath did not know how long he watched the slow spread of the liquid or followed the reflections of the broken glass, but at last he closed his eyes, clenched his fists, and disappeared. The remnants of his frustration and sadness remained behind, staining the stones beneath the red spatter as the room sat in insufferable silence. Quick break. Trem gazed, blinking into the glaring sun, and tried to remember how he'd gotten here, or indeed where here was. A light touch of a sharp point at his throat brought him to, and he stared up at the blade to see a pair of brilliant green eyes looking down at him. Too slow, Vakhtyn said impassively. Try again. Trem felt the nick of the blade sliding down his chest as Vakhtyn Elvak, advisor to Bullwife the warrior, commander of Aves, stepped back to let him rise. The half-elf heaved himself upward, wincing as he did so, and looked about for his own weapon. The far planer's sword lay a few feet to his right, and he walked stiffly to retrieve it as Vakhtyn lectured him. You must always understand the circumstances of the duel as it unfolds. If you are on the defensive, you wait for the opportunity to unbalance your opponent or counter their attack, but never force the issue. When you have the upper hand and are dictating the flow of battle, do not lunge or reach for the final blow. Let your enemy falter or err and take advantage of them. Trem picked up his sword and flexed his right arm as he did so, replying, You mean that I must be waiting for their mistake, not trying to create one on my own? Vakhtyn tossed back his long, dark cloak and exhaled audibly. He was a tall, imposing figure, made more so by his silvery chainmail and dark leather boots, rising almost to his knees. His vast cloak, which seemed to float independently of the wind within the fortress courtyard, was held on his shoulders by two clasps shaped like skeletal hands. He brushed back his shock-white hair with one hand. Trem noted he was not sweating, but the young trainee was drenched. Vakhtyn never seemed to sweat, or breathe heavily, no matter how many hours they spent sparring. You talk like Bull does, about patience and openings. That's not what I mean. Evaluate the opponent, and use your mind as much as your physical gifts. He pointed his sword at Trem and said, You've been trying to outpace me ever since I began teaching you, but I'm faster and more skilled. Speed will not let you overcome me. Frustrated, Trem blew several strands of wet hair from his face and asked, Then what am I supposed to do? You're better than me. Find a way. Vakhtyn struck suddenly, and without warning, Trem was just nimble enough to sidestep him and set his feet, but the cloak whirled, and behind it came Vakhtyn's fist slamming into his chest. Trem grunted and stumbled, but kept his feet, and scuttled back a few steps, trying to buy time. Think, Waterhound, his foe called out. Vakhtyn came at him again, and the half-elf began to furiously consider his options. Unable to reach a clear plan of action, he settled on holding his ground, deflecting the first two strikes leveled at him. He knew that he could not stand in one spot and fight back. The bull had tried to train him to hold a high guard and set a broad stance, the better to block and swiftly counter. Vakhtyn had scoffed at the idea. Trem was physically very different from Bull, and had to learn to fight in a way that suited him. His size and strength are his advantages, the lost elf had told Trem. He's like a tree that sets root in the ground, and you are just a sapling. You need to learn to bend in the breeze of a battle. So Trem bent, pivoting away from Vakhtyn and trying to think of his next move. The older warrior held his blade before him and perpendicular to the ground, and at shoulder height, allowing him to quickly thrust, slash, or parry. Trem had never been able to reach through his guard, and most attempts to do so had ended with him being driven to the ground. He looked elsewhere, considering Vakhtyn's always shifting feet. The half-elf adopted a lower crouch than normal, the better to move explosively like a coiled spring, and brought his own sword low, beneath his waist, extending his free hand towards his opponent to track him. Vakhtyn paused as he considered this change in tactics, and Trem thought he caught a note of minor approval in his eyes, but then the veteran swordsman was quick to test the new strategy. He came at Trem aggressively, but the half-elf ducked and wove his way clear. Parrying a few swings as he tried to maneuver away from Vakhtyn's front. The half-elf feinted a step backwards. When he saw Vakhtyn move as though to follow him, he quickly changed momentum, and closed with his teacher, striking for his shoulder. Vakhtyn was caught by surprise, but able to deflect the blow. He grabbed Trem with his free hand as the two were now face to face, and smiled. Much better, Waterhound. You do have some brains in you, after all. The lost elf shoved his pupil away and set his feet again. Trem returned to his new lower stance and began trying to analyze other possible means of getting under Vakhtyn's guard. Suddenly, almost on a whim, he attacked rather than waiting for Vakhtyn to begin their fight anew. Trem had always been a defensive fighter with Vakhtyn, believing he was simply too skilled for the developing swordsman to try and test, but with the praise of his teacher and his own burgeoning confidence, Trem was driven to try and set the pace. His assault was swift and controlled enough to force Vakhtang into a slight retreat, but Trem realized he'd overplayed his hand when one of his searching swings failed to connect with anything but the air. Vakhtang had anticipated and avoided the last strike, and he was now turning on his left leg to hit at Trem's exposed flank. Vakhtang's boot slipped in the mud and he stumbled, almost falling to his knees, but catching himself with his free hand. Trem stepped backward to allow him to rise, and a fire flared in the green orbs that were Vakhtang's eyes. "What are you doing? Fool!" Vakhtang rose in an offensive barrage so forceful Trem was blasted backward, desperately trying to repel blows that were threatening to break his guard and maybe even end his life. The half-elf acquitted himself well for a short time, and then Vakhtang threw him off balance with a looping cut and kicked him in the chest, knocking him to the ground. The lost elf knelt over him, his face inches from Trem's own, and his unique rune-etched blade pressed to the half-elf's throat. "You had your chance," he snarled, and Trem could tell his fury was real and terrible. You cannot allow such opportunities to slip away. There is no courtesy in war, no honorable combat. There is victory or death. Vakhtang held Trem's eyes a while longer. Then he stood abruptly and turned away. "We are done for the day." Trem rose slowly, and despite his own understanding that this was not a subject to feud with Vakhtang about, said angrily, "Why must I learn to fight dishonorably? Are we not here to uphold the virtues of the Aves and the Eagle Knights?" Vakhtang's laugh was short and harsh. "Virtues? If you want virtues, kiss your hilt like a pious Angledaic before you fight. Maybe you'll still get your guard up before your less honorable foe runs you through." Vakhtang spat his derision into the dirt. "Aves is the same order that banned all but purebred humans, and only male humans at that, from their ranks. You and I are only here because they are desperate. We are not part of their hallowed tradition, any more than their weapons or armor. I would even venture to say their horses get more respect than us." Trem brushed the dirt from his worn tunic, then thought the better of it, and dropped his head to rip the sweat and mud-soaked fabric. Dropped his weapon to rip the sweat and mud-soaked fabric over his head. He brought his eyes up to meet Vakhtang's and pressed further, saying, "Bull thinks more highly of you than others. He invited the other races to come and fight. Perhaps he'll change the Eagle Knight's restrictions." Vakhtang snorted and turned his back on Trem, walking towards a long trough of water. He dunked his head in it and ran his hands through his hair, the droplets coming down steadily into the vat. Unclasping his cloak, he tossed it to the earth and shook his long white hair a few times as he spoke. "Bullwife Margrave is a true Eagle Knight, and like it or not, that means he's as racist and misogynist as the rest of them. Should we somehow survive this siege, and the order is preserved, he shall return it to the bastion of prejudice and arrogance it has always been." Trem picked up his filthy clothes and walked towards Vakhtang. "I don't understand. If you hate Aves and the Order so much, why are you here? Why fight for something you clearly believe to be wrong or even evil?" Vakhtang lifted his head and looked at Trem thoughtfully for a moment, then said quietly, "There's nothing in the world that suggests it is divided by simplistic ideas like good and evil, Trem. Only powerful fools and dead men believe in such luxuries. I'm here because if Aves falls, that which would rise in its place would be worse than what is here now." Trem considered this, and Vakhtang removed his mail shirt and tunic, throwing it atop his cloak. Vakhtang's exposed skin was almost as white as his hair, but Trem had never seen him shirtless before, and was shocked to see his back was covered entirely by an immense tattoo. The body of a scaled dragon rose from the small of his back up to the base of Vakhtang's skull, where the head faced Trem and a mouth of fangs opened, a bestial roar almost audible in the intricacy of the artwork. Along the backs of his arms, 4 more dragons' heads emerged from the wings of the central one, 2 to each arm. Trem studied the magnificent design in silent awe, and Vakhtang, who had been tossing water over his shoulders and chest, seemed to realize he was being scrutinized. He grabbed a rough-looking burlap sack from above the basin and tossed it over his shoulders, somewhat obscuring the finery on his skin. "Why the dragons?" Trem asked him. Vakhtang paused, and for a moment Trem thought he would not answer him. Then the lost elf took a few steps towards his armor and clothing, laying discarded on the ground, and said, "They are the 5 dragons believed to still be on Tethtanir. Some say they're the only 5 that ever existed. You should get something to eat, and some rest, and have Beradrin look at your blade. You don't want any nicks to get too deep and lead to a break he cannot repair." Before Trem could press further on the matter of the tattoo, Vakhtang was gone. He strode out from under the wall, where they had been beside the trough of water, and across the courtyard, pulling his shirt and chainmail on as he did. The knights and would-be knights gave him a wide berth. They might not like the strange foreigner, but they respected and, more importantly, feared him. Trem watched Vakhtang go until he was rounding the fortress and out of sight. Then he bent down and took a handful of water, bringing it to his lips. The warm, likely filthy liquid was all he had access to for now. He spat when the grit in it ran across his tongue, and painfully shifted his weight and sat on the edge of the trough. He then noticed his superior, Sir Jonathan Blade, standing some distance from him, watching. Trem gave the knight a wave of recognition, and the man came over. Without a word, Jonathan Blade sat beside Trem and scanned the courtyard. There were pockets of knights and lower-ranking members of the defenders running about on various tasks. The enemy was closing in on their walls, and everyone knew soon the fighting that had been taking place around Aves would be happening right at their front door. Jonathan Blade spoke as though to no one in particular. Elvaka is a tough man to learn from. Trem did not respond, but rubbed his arm where a particularly vicious bruise was starting to show. Jonathan looked at him and added, "You seem to be holding your own, though. That's good. We'll need it when the time comes." "It seems it's coming soon." Jonathan Blade sighed, more an expression of inevitability than sadness or frustration. "It does seem so. You need to make certain your training is not so vigorous it prevents you from being fighting fit. Our unit is likely to see heavy combat." Trem looked sideways at Jonathan. He was a strong, commanding presence that the half-elf had quickly come to respect. He rarely raised his voice and never disparaged his troops, quite unlike Vakhtid and even Bullwife. Jonathan had come from somewhere outside the region of Dragon's Watch, and was certainly not purely a Lagosian heritage. Trem had heard from his fellow men that Jonathan had joined their knights to atone for his past sins. There were many rumors about precisely what he had needed to atone for, and Trem did not believe he should press him on the matter. Jonathan had done him and the other non-human soldiers of their company a great service by taking them under his direction, providing a sense of camaraderie that they would not have found with other groups in the Order. Trem considered his commanding officer's words before saying, "You mean we'll be thrown to the wolves, because our deaths would not be mourned in Aves." Jonathan stood and took a few steps away from Trem, looking out over the courtyard again, scanning with his arms crossed. He turned to Trem and laughed mirthlessly as he said, "I'll not lie to you, Trem. That is exactly what I believe will happen. This army of the Lion is coming to Aves. They'll be gathered outside the town that surrounds our walls by nightfall, and we will be the first line of defense should Commander Margrave deign to send any men outside our walls." Jonathan staved off further discussion by unhooking his waterskin and tossing it to his soldier. "Get your rest and see to your blade. I can recover that from you later. I think you need it more than me." Trem caught the waterskin and lifted his head to reply, but Jonathan was already gone. He rose stiffly from his impromptu seat and pulled the cap free, downing a great pull of cool, clean water. He looked around, as Jonathan had, and took in the finer details of the whole scene before him. Men walked or ran from place to place, each with an implacable expression of focus on their face. The fight for Aves was impending, and it was easier to fixate on the immediate necessities of preparation than to consider what would happen when the time came. Trem picked up his belongings and slowly walked past the barracks, to the very back of their rough wooden structures, to where his unit was stationed. Beside the long, simple wooden and slate-roofed building sat a squat stone house with a heavy thatch roof. Outside, on a large hunk of partially chiseled rock, sat a dwarf, whittling. He had long, dark brown hair extending to a wide, partially braided beard, and wore heavy steel mail made to look like scales of some fish or reptile. His heavy boots were spread the width of his broad shoulders, and the brilliant eyes did not move from his work, which was rapidly taking shape in his large, strong hands. Trem paused in front of the dwarf and threw his clothes to the ground. Without looking up, the stern voice of the other man came rolling out. "With your fine complexion, lad, you ought to get a shirt on to avoid a serious sunburn." His eyes came up as he gestured at the bright orb overhead, still high in the sky. "You're not made for this time of day." Trem did not answer, flopping down on the ground beside the great hunk of stone and laying back, hands on his forehead and eyes closed. "Beradrin, you are always so full of good advice." The dwarf snorted loudly before replying, "Not that it does you any good. You never listen to sense." Says the dwarven prince of stone who has refused to leave a fortress under siege by an enemy that is not his. Trem eyed his friend's work and added, "I never understood why you use your hands to whittle when your people are so enamored with the casual use of the arcane." "There's nothing casual about the arcane. We dwarves just see it as a tool rather than a pathway to some kind of mystical supremacy." Beradrin considered his next cut in the wood and said, "As for my presence in Aves, well, you're still here too, unless I woke up and my fine accommodations were transported to another castle while I slept." "Point taken," Trem said. "Can you take a look at my blade? Vakhtid was rather hard in it today." Beradrin stopped his rapid, clean strokes of the knife against the wood and dropped his hands to his thighs. "I suppose that means he hit the sword more than he hit you. I guess I should be grateful, but you keep begging for my services no matter how many times I've told you I'm not a smith, like most dwarves. Where you other mortals got your absurd legends of us as metalworkers?" Trem let the comment trail off without response, having heard all of his friend's gripes before. He poured the rest of the water Sir Jonathan had given him down his throat and dropped the empty leather sack to the earth. He closed his eyes and let his breathing slow, becoming more rhythmic and steady. A soft nudge of a boot against his ribs brought one eyelid up. Beradrin stood over him, hands on hips. "Pull your foolish, oversized dagger free, and I'll see what I can do, lad. Then go get some rest. We're on watch tonight." "I'm the one on watch. You're an ambassador, not a soldier." Beradrin scoffed at the comment, taking the sword from Trem's outstretched hand with a yank. "If I don't go with you, I suspect you'd fall off the battlements. We are on watch. I'll meet you north of the gatehouse when night falls, between the towers." Trem watched his friend turn and stamp off to the smithy, pulling the blade partially free of the scabbard and grumbling at its condition. The half-elf hefted himself onto his hands, but only pulled his knees towards his chest and did not rise. Setting his elbows on his knees, he ran one hand through his mostly dried hair and gazed toward the barracks. With a grimace and a push that felt more difficult than it should have, he got to his feet and stumbled through the door, asleep almost before his head hit the straw pillow in the nearest empty bunk. Trem did not know where the dream began, but he felt it solidify around him slowly, purposefully, and he knew the sensation from times before. He fought against it, trying to stay out of that other dream, the one he knew was pulling at him and wrenching his mind past the state of unconscious rest toward something else. Trem had been in the dreamscape before. On several occasions it did not relish a return, but the force, whatever it was, would not let him go. The solidity of the dreaming world crystallized, and he was standing in a room clad in an open-frocked white shirt and thinly woven brown trousers. But he was barefoot, and he could feel the uneven stone beneath his toes, cool as smooth despite its undulating appearance and form. He looked about him, saw no doors or windows, and understood that he had been brought here even as he realized that in the waking world it would have been impossible. When his eyes came back to the table, he started, for a black-robed figure was now behind it, facing away from him with its hood drawn up. The voice across from him came out from the folds of cloth in a smooth, firm tone. "Why are you here, Trem Waterhound?" Immediately the half-elf was on guard. "I didn't choose to be here. Something brought me. How do you know who I am?" The head turned slightly, and looking at Trem over the shadowy folds of one shoulder with deep, dark, and fiercely penetrating eyes. "I know because I have observed you from afar. I ask not why you are here in the world of dreaming, but why you are in Aves, among those who so detest your kind." Still unsure of who or what he was dealing with, Trem was careful in his reply. "I came to Aves seeking refuge in a noble cause worthy of my efforts." "Ah." Now the form turned around fully, and Trem could see the bleach-white skin and tightly drawn face even in the shadows of the cowl. "But is this valiant defense of Aves truly deserving of your efforts? What do you know of the invaders, other than what little the Order of the Eagle Knights has deigned to tell you?" The half-elf took in the skeletal hands that embraced one another, binding fingers just visible in the folds of the figure's cloak, and replied, "I've watched them butcher their foes, even those who surrendered in cold blood. I know enough." "That is merely war." The creature strode forward and waved a hand over the table. It sprang suddenly to life, a perfect miniature recreation of Aves, now with soldiers crawling all over it and about it like so many tiny humanoid ants. Fire and hunks of stone erupted from catapulted rocks and inflamed missiles. Staring down the scene, the foreign presence continued, "War claims lives, even those who are perhaps innocent of crimes or hatred, yet war is necessary, for the invaders will burn and loot and destroy. But when they are done, they will rebuild, they will replant, and then the land will be replenished along with her people, but under one leadership and one vision. Tell me, Trem, do you want to see Legotia united to one cause, or do you wish to let her people continue to flounder as so many disparate lands feuding with one another, and vulnerable to the dread forces that surround them?" "You're suggesting I join one of these dread forces, rather than stand by the people who call this place home?" The black eyes came up and the voice dropped low, becoming hauntingly threatening. "The army of the lion is not the danger of which I speak. Know that there lies a place, the beyond, wherein the blackness of space seems empty, but it is not. If only it were. But there lurk in the deepest corners of that expanse dread things that should not be, and will come to your world as surely as they shall to my own." The hands came up and the hood was pulled back, revealing the long black hair that framed the thin but strong features. "I know this because I am Naroth, god of death and shepherd of mortal souls. I will guide you safely to the dead realms when the time comes, and I tell you the war you have begun to care so deeply about is a small thing." To the shock of the immortal, Trem laughed. It was light at first, and then louder and almost insultingly dismissive. Trem stepped forward and put his hands on the edge of the table, watching them pass through the illusion of the western walls of Aves. He leaned forward and gave a cold smile. "You should know, god of death, that I will not be in your charge for some time, perhaps ever, for it's by the machinations of your own kind that I do not age and have lived for so long frozen in youth, so it does nothing to sway me to speak of some calamity that may come from mortality and your fellows. I owe you and your kind nothing." Naroth did not visibly act, merely returning the hard look from the bold man before him. Instead, he watched Trem for a while, then he took a different approach. "You've been trading with Vakhtyn Elvak, yes?" "I have." Trem was too surprised by the shift in direction of the conversation to dismiss or deflect the question. "You know that his family have served me for eons." Naroth reached upward and touched the skeletal hands of silver at his neck. "This same symbol you have seen on Vakhtyn's cloak? It's the Elvak representation of their service to me. They are among my most loyal adherents on Tethtinir." Trem was, despite himself, puzzled and curious. But then why is Vakhtyn fighting for Aves? You seem more interested in the success of the invasion from the west. Narath's brow furrowed, and he replied, "We have had something of a disagreement in matters of method, but our purpose remains the same. There is a greater threat coming to all of us that must be met with unity and purpose, one that will make the arcane wars of 3 centuries ago a mere skirmish by comparison. We must see what needs to be done." There was no chance to respond, for Trem was suddenly swept downward and shrunk at the same time, spiraling towards the illusionary walls of Aves. He felt a wave of dizziness and nausea as he whirled about, and then he was at his post in the eastern wall, between the gatehouse and the tower. In the sudden transportation, he shut his eyes to blot out the swirling mass of the world before him, but he could feel the stone beneath his bare feet, now that he now recognized was the smooth, worn platform of the curtain wall. Trem opened his eyes, leaning forward on the battlements to keep his footing. Figures danced in the distance. He could not be sure who they were, but a deep dread filled him at the sight of their twisted and contorting bodies. With revulsion, he turned back to the fortress, wondering what he would find. The keep stood straight and firm, but it returned him to some level of mental stability until he looked deeper. Flames danced in the windows of the keep, brighter and more violent than those in the distant sky. It made Trem fearful and anxious. Something was wrong, but where was the root of the impending doom he felt growing inside of him? The castle burned from within, but Trem could not see what, other than flames, was inside of it. There had to be something outside of the keep or the walls. He turned again, looking across the roofs of the town around Aves, and trying to discern anything amid the shimmering images in the distance. The fiends in the distance had unnerved him, but the misshapen trees hid something sinister that roiled in the pit of his stomach. From all about him, as though carried on the wind, came Narath's voice. "The world you fight to preserve is rotting from within. The racism that keeps those of your elven lineage from joining the knights, from aiding the people of Dragon's Watch, it is their tradition. It will eclipse whatever honors you earn in service to their cause, and the flames of that hatred will spread, sowing disorder and ruin." From the horror of the writhing flames and faint tops of trees, the dreaded creatures took shape. Though their form could not have been described, nor their uniform in it, their design, they crushed everything before them, rushing forward with a torrent of unearthly cries and flailing limbs and misshapen tendrils. Trem threw his hands in front of his face. They broke upon the wall and crashed over the battlements, great roaring madness mere inches from him. Then it was gone, and when he looked outward between his raised hands, he saw the town about the fortress, the dragon-scale mountains rising to the northeast, and the encampment of the army of the lion between the two. Narath's voice came again. "These outsiders will bring order. They will give those in Dragon's Watch and many other lands a chance to face the beyond and what comes from it. Tonight, another of my servants will pass you by. Do not impede him. Let him do what must be done, and take up arms on the proper side of this petty war to prevent what horrors may come." Trem turned once again, and the keep now sat squat and quiet within the walls, but the flames still danced in the highest rooms, where Bull kept his quarters. There was a crack of thunder and a sharp lance of lightning that revealed a shadowy figure moving swiftly towards the great culvert at the base of the keep. As Trem watched, the rain poured down about him, and the thunder roared again. In the next flash, he saw the same shadow in one of those lower rooms of the large building. Then, at the last flare of light, the figure was amid the flames, and the blinding strike faded. So too did the fire, and darkness consumed everything about him. Trem hovered in space, standing on nothing, surrounded by nothing, and Narath's voice wrapped around him like a blanket. "Let him through, Trem, and prove that you serve no master, no order, but your own." Trem shot up from his bunk so suddenly that he smashed his forehead off of the bed above him. The dream had been too real, too tangible, to not have been something more than a vivid accompaniment to a deep sleep. He had been in such places in his past unwittingly and derived some knowledge from the experience, but this had been so much more powerful and carefully curated. Trem rubbed his eyes and looked around, a new sensation of horror taking over as he realized the sun was almost down and he was late to his watch. Scrambling from the bunk, he dressed hurriedly in his spare clothes and grabbed his worn bow from the weapon rack by the door, sprinting across the yard to the stairs leading to the wall. He reached its height in a flash, dodging other soldiers and ignoring their cries as he did, looking about sharply for any sign of Baradrin. The dwarf coughed loudly, and Trem glanced downward, realizing he was actually quite close to his friend, but looking farther than necessary for him, missing that he was standing next to Trem in plain sight. The dwarf handed him his blade and muttered, "She'll hold a while longer, lad, but maybe try and avoid angering your teacher so much. He's taken a few real chunks from the steel." Trem accepted the weapon and nodded in thanks, but Baradrin could see the confusion in his eyes and, behind it, some lingering concern that was unfamiliar to him. "What's eating you, lad? I let you sleep a bit knowing you needed it. No reason to worry about your delayed arrival." Trem looked over the battlements, stepping forward and placing his right hand on the crenellation between the raised teeth of the wall. He said nothing for a time, but watched the fluttering of so many banners out among the enemy army, close enough that he was certain even Berridron could see the details in several of the flags, despite not having Trem's sharp elven eyes. They were long banners attached at one vertical side, and depicting 2 blue lions crowned with gold on a red field. Those symbols were the most common, but scattered among them were others of the famed imperial houses, some with orange crosses on white fields, and even more with yellow mountains against black cloth. There were also great tents of incredible size mixed in among the smaller lower ones that seemed to cover all the earth around Aves. Unlike the circular tents of the Lagosian peoples, these western shelters had squared tops, overhanging canvas extending from the entrances. Trem had to admit that they were far finer looking than those of Aves' own campaign tents. Trem did not rest his watch on one point of the vast camp, however. He searched high and low for something he could not describe, a shadowy figure of indeterminate form, but he saw no such thing no matter how hard he looked. Another throat clearing from Berridron brought Trem back around to his friend, and he sighed before saying, "I'm sorry, Berridron. There's just something on my mind is all." Berridron gave no sign that he was overly interested in what might be eating his companion, instead shouldering his fearsome hammer and stepping towards the wall. "Maybe you're a bit too preoccupied with our new neighbors? Trust me, Trem, these walls can hold out against a great deal." Trem did not answer, but settled into the routine of the watch in an attempt to clear his mind. The night came on swiftly, and with Berridron to aid him, he was able to cover more ground than his fellow guards might have on their own. The garrison was already stretched incredibly thin, trying to cover all the necessary positions around the fortress, and most of the non-human recruits were given menial jobs that kept them from important locations, but also put greater strain on their human counterparts. Trem was only on the wall because he'd proven both eagle-eyed and a good shot, which his superiors acknowledged made him useful, even if they didn't like admitting it. Trem knew that he owed his position in large part to Sir Jonathan Blade, who had stood up for him several times as he was assigned to his unit of non-human volunteers. The dark was increased by heavy cloud cover, and Trem found even he had difficulty piercing the inky night with his powerful eyes. Berridron largely gave up, and instead sitting against the stone and listening to the sounds of encroaching foes, rather than staring futilely into the distance. Trem had not forgotten his dream, and in fact was probably more alert than ever given his sense that something was about to happen. It was nearly the 3rd hour of the morning, the deepest part of the night, when he felt compelled to gaze over a particular spot in the wall. He saw it then, just a movement amid the blackness, but he knew what it was. Rather than call out or ready his weapon, he simply watched and waited, still unsure of what he would or should do. The figure drew closer, and Trem saw it was clad in dark robes of gray and a deep red about the edges, bearing a number of short blades around its waist. Even as it neared the top of the wall, he could not tell if it was male or female, or indeed what race of the mortal people of Tethtonir it belonged to, but he watched intently as the spider-like form came onward, never hesitating, though it surely had seen him. Realizing his companion had remained stock-still for a time, Berridron heaved himself upward and began walking towards Trem. He watched as the half-elf stepped back slightly, and a sudden, swift ball of cloth launched over the wall to land beside him. Berridron immediately put his small, single-hand crossbow free and pointed at the figure, but Trem raised both hands, one toward the dwarf, the other toward his spidery invader, staving off any immediate quarrel. Berridron hissed at him. "What are you doing, lad? He's clearly not one of ours." The figure straightened and reached into his many folds of cloth, pulling forth a small, flat token and tossing it on the ground at Trem's feet. The half-elf and his dwarven friend stared at it together, recognizing the white skull with flared cheekbones and long jawline bereft of lower mandibles on a black field, the symbol of Neroth. Trem looked at the invader, who looked back at him with green eyes precisely like Vakhtân's, and the half-elf froze, unsure of what to do. The intruder did not pause to consider what might be going through his head, instead glancing sharply at Berridron to ensure his crossbow was no longer trained on the invader. Then he leapt from the wall and landed noiselessly on the ground below. Both Trem and Berridron rushed to the edge and stared in disbelief, for such a leap should have crippled any man or beast, but instead the figure was now scurrying quickly towards the cistern drain in the distance, at the base of the legendary keep. Trem turned back and bent down to pick up the small stone and metal disc. Berridron glared at him, then back at the keep, and finally in complete and utter exasperation shouted, "What in Termodon's name did we just allow, Trem? Who or what was that?" Trem was staring at the symbol in his hand, but he spoke quietly in response. "He said I should let him through, that I should serve no master but myself." "Who?" Berridron was irate now, and gave up on merely trying to reason with his friend. He grabbed Trem roughly by the arm and, with considerable strength, pulled him round and downward until they were face to face. "Who said let him in, Trem?" "Neroth," the half-elf answered solemnly. "In a dream, he said to let him through, that the invasion would be terrible but unity would be achieved, that there are greater evils out there than the Imperial army at our gates." Berridron would have none of it. He slapped Trem across the face, hard. "And he told you to serve no master but yourself? Isn't that really asking you to do what the god of death wants? Well, now I'm telling you, lad, you just let a damned assassin into Aves, and the man who gave you that blade is about to get me killed if we don't do something." Trem had somewhat snapped out of his internal struggle when Berrigan struck him, and after the accusatory tirade he had finally wrenched himself free of his fugue state. Looking at the door with a face full of shock and horrific realization, he said, "He's going to kill Bullwife, end the invasion by killing the defending general and breaking our will to fight. Naroth wants the army of the Lion to unite all Lagosha against some horror yet to come." Berrigan's voice was even and low as he replied, "Well, you swore to stop that same army, no matter what you think a god told you to do or not to do. I don't know about any other dangers to us or Aves, but I know there's a murderous foreigner from across the Syrian sea waiting to get in here, and I doubt any of us will live to see what happens afterwards if he succeeds." Trem looked sharply at Berrigan, then at the long trench leading to the grate where the assassin was just now slipping down the gully into the wet slop. Without a word, the half-elf jumped from the wall and sprang off the roof of the nearest barracks, spiraling and twirling awkwardly, but safely to the ground, and taking off after the invader as fast as he could. Totally shocked and confused, Berrigan watched him go as he railed to himself in exasperation. "Oh yes, bloody fine, boy. I'll raise the guard myself then, I suppose. I'll raise the whole damned fortress by myself." Berrigan pulled forth his hammer and ran towards the nearest metal brace set in the stone of the wall, began striking it furiously as he roared out, "Invader! Assassin in the fortress! To the commander!" Trem heard the cry go up in the slow, confused response of those on duty, who were unsure what precisely was happening. He reached the slanted mud edge of the filthy drainage flow and slid down into the viscous and discolored water below. Slowed somewhat by the thick slop beneath his feet, he gamely pushed onward until he reached the grate and glanced up to see how his target had made his way through it. But the narrow bars, the openings too small to have allowed a body to pass through them, appeared undamaged. Trem noted that the ground beneath them was soft and gave way, so he kicked hard to see if it would allow passage underneath the iron, and to his shock, the whole mass of mud and earth collapsed under his first strike, sweeping him downward, and causing him to cut his face and arm against the metal teeth of the spikes at the base of the crossbars of metal blocking the culvert. Trem fell into the sewer, its putrid muck not being very deep, but still wet enough to create a significant splash. He swore sharply as he heard a distant hiss of rage far down the tunnel he was now crouched in. Trem knew that he had alerted his quarry. Rather than waiting to see if his foe had decided to come back and silence him, or was rushing forward into the keep, Trem jumped up and raced through the scum and slowly running water at his feet, moving steadily upward and against the gentle slope of the rough sewer masonry as he did. It was dark, and his half-elven eyes could discern the path before him, but it was murky. Trem knew that at such an aggressive pace, a knife in the dark would easily take him unawares. Then he heard a crashing noise ahead of him and saw a heavy iron grate swinging from the ceiling of the stone roof in faint torchlight above. As he neared the opening, he considered whether he ought to press on and try to find another means of entering the keep, a reason that if he did, he would be no more likely to find his way to Bull's quarters, which he had never visited, than if he stayed on the trail of the intruder. Reasoning that catching the assassin before he reached Bull's rooms was his best course of action, Trem ran forward and jumped, catching the lip of the opening in the floor and pulling himself upward as he looked about for any danger. From the surroundings, it appeared as though he was somewhere in the servants' quarters, the slop room where they tossed out the uneaten rations, emptied latrine buckets, and disposed of any other refuse within the fortress. To Trem's shock, he saw, hunched in the doorway of the small, foul-smelling room, the assassin. The green eyes regarded him emotionlessly as the wiry figure spun and slammed the heavy wooden door shut, peeking out the barred window as the bolt slammed in place. Without waiting to see if Trem would try to follow, his foe turned and disappeared. "Fool," Trem snarled. He wasn't sure if he meant himself for his noisy and crashing pursuit, or his quarry for thinking the door would stop him. But he ignored the thought as he lurched out of the drain. Gathering himself, he charged the door with an indiscernible yell. Smashing into the heavy portal, he lurched off it and nearly fell. He thought he had heard the wood crack, or perhaps it was his bones, and kicked the door furiously with his boot as he stumbled back. This time he heard the snapping timbers, and it renewed his resolve. He launched himself full force at the door again with his left shoulder. Trem burst through the opening and landed in the hall, on top of the door, with such a roaring boom that he heard the guards above him shout in surprise. As they rallied one another for the defense of the fortress, Trem shook his head in an attempt to silence his ringing ears. He stumbled to his feet and pulled his sword free, wobbling into an awkward jog as he headed for the stairs. Guards were running back and forth above him, but he could hear a large contingent coming from the far end, headed for the door he had so brazenly smashed. He had no time to meet them and explain that he was acting in service to Aves, and without apprehending the invader, he would simply look like a failed assassin himself, one who was trying to talk his way out of an execution. The half-elf had to catch the killer and expose him. There was no alternative now. Trem raced upwards to the ground floor, sprinting through the last vestige of servants' quarters to the foyer of the main hall. The guards had abandoned the doors, perhaps heading towards the main entrance of the surrounding public rooms to defend the most direct points of entry. Pushing his way through the heavy double doors, Trem entered the commander's hall, where Bullwife and those before him had held court with their advisors and loyal followers. Trem could see, even in the faint light of the exterior torches, the door of the back passage to the private quarters of Bull, his guests, and the advisors had been left ajar, a faint flickering glow emanating past it. Sprinting through the eerie colors splashed across the floor from the high stained glass windows, Trem reached the opening and slid through. Guards were now running about the castle in all directions, checking less used doors and other furtive entrances, clearly unsure of where the threat was coming from. Trem hoped the commotion had roused Bull, but he could not be sure, nor did he trust the guards had gone to check his private quarters. The half-elf sped up the stairs to the second floor, dodging past half-awake and confused advisors and off-duty guards stumbling from their rooms as he headed towards Bullwife's lodging on the third floor. Reaching the alcove with its high and broad stairs, narrowing as they rose up the balcony before Bull's bedroom door, he jumped the desks and lined with maps and reports. Speeding up the right side of the staircase, he could not see any guardsmen, an unsettling thought as someone should have stopped him by now, for surely they would not have left the commander alone in his private chamber under such circumstances. As he crested the final stair, a figure lurched out of the shadows and smashed into him, hurling Trem down in front of Bull's doorway. Trem lost his sword as he landed, but he spun, coiling himself to lurch desperately at its prone form on the ground before him when he saw his attacker. Vakhtyn al-Vak, with a shocked look on his face, stepped forward, planting his boot on the blade. "Waterhound? You best have a good reason for being here. There is some foul play afoot." Trem rose to a crouch and eyed the white-haired warrior suspiciously, remembering the same entirely green eyes of the figure he had allowed over the battlements, just like those he now saw set in Vakhtyn's stern face. "There's an assassin after Bullwife. I was in pursuit of him. What are you doing here?" Vakhtyn accepted the explanation and kicked the blade to Trem. "What I am doing here is not your concern, and for all this assassin talk, there's only one intruder I see within Aves, you." Vakhtyn nodded to the blade Trem had just picked up from the stones of the floor, an arm no less. "This doesn't look good for you, Trem. I think you had better start from the beginning before other guards come and are less willing to hear your reasoning for storming through the fortress." Vakhtyn's hand stole to his hilt, slowly and furtively, but Trem noted the gesture and tensed. Vakhtyn had not only voiced the most obvious conclusion to be drawn from finding the half-elf outside Bull's rooms, but what Trem feared others would suspect as well. The half-elf doubted his story of dreams would be well received or even believable, especially if anyone learned of Trem's permissive attitude towards the invader that had scaled the wall. As he tried to find the words that would ease Vakhtyn's fears, several things happened at once. Awakened by the commotion of the guards and hearing Trem's clattering sword, Bullwife Margrave, armed with a broken bedpost, burst from his door expecting to see an assailant. Perplexed by the scene before him, and rather comically wearing only his nightclothes, he relaxed briefly, just as the assassin Trem had been pursuing flipped over the balcony from beneath the landing and lunged at the commander, a long, thin blade raised to strike. Trem, nearby and already crouched in readiness, hurled himself between them, intercepting the would-be killer and taking the piercing dagger in the left shoulder. The two crashed to the ground where Vakhtyn kicked the invader off Trem swiftly and shouted at the other two to stay back. Bullwife seemed to hesitate, wanting to engage the intruder himself, but Vakhtyn had already positioned himself between them. The assassin had rolled quickly to his or her feet and slowly rose, pulling forth two long curved daggers held with the blades pointed downward, braced against the forearms. Vakhtyn noted the eyes, as Trem had, and a quiet recognition came to his voice as he said, "A knife of Croarl, here. They must have paid you a great deal for this." There was no response, and the figure took one step forward, then lunged to his left, rebounding off the wall and trying to stretch around Vakhtyn to Bull. Trem was rising to defend the commander when a torrential spray of red blood struck him and Bullwife. Vakhtyn stood before them, his sword upraised, the assassin's body twitching on the ground as blood poured from a massive slashing wound across his chest. Vakhtyn knelt and ripped the hooded mask free, pulling the still living and bloody mouth open to glance inside before releasing the head and turning to the other two. He was one of the knives. I almost can't believe it. Trem was on his feet then, pulling the thin dagger free and holding his wounded shoulder. "Why did you look in his mouth? What are the knives?" Bull grunted as understanding dawned on him. Approaching the rapidly dying form, he bent low to examine it. The knives of Croarl, an assassin order from Had and Merk, where Vakhtyn's ancestors originally hailed from. The most fervent of their kind cut their tongues out, as the god of murder is said to have no voice or tongue. He speaks only through his art. A few of the castle guards had arrived and were sprinting up the stairs, but the commander waved them off, and they took up positions around the three on the balcony, all looking a bit embarrassed to have been absent for the battle. Bull, modesty forgotten despite his scant dress, stepped forward to help Trem steady himself as he said, "So much for interrogating him, Vakhtyn." The green-eyed warrior coldly wiped his blade on a rough cloth taken from within his tunic. "Your safety was my first concern, my lord." "Indeed." Bull eyed Trem up and down, his large thumb squeezing his injured shoulder. "Put pressure on that wound, lad. I'll bring you something to hold against it in a moment. You smell as foul as a latrine." Trem grimaced and said, "Sewer, sir. Roughly the same." Vakhtyn snorted, and Bull turned his attention to his advisor. Go and bring me a healer and send 2 guards. You've served me well again, Vakhtyn, but I need to speak to this one alone for a moment. Vakhtyn threw a sharp salute to Bull before shooting Trem a brief but meaningful look. Bull led the half-elf into his private chamber and set him on a massive armchair. Just rest a moment. Here, use this old tunic. It's cleaner than you are. Trem accepted the thick cloth and pressed it hard against the wound, which was bleeding more than he would have expected from such a narrow weapon. Bull pulled a worn-looking pair of trousers and faded gray tunic on before dragging forth his own seat and settling his massive frame in front of the young half-elf, whom he had only recently raised to the rank of sword. They merely locked eyes for a few minutes before Bull leaned back and asked, So how did you know? A wave of fear washed over Trem, but he tried to deflect the inquiry. Know what, my lord? How did you know there was an assassin coming through the halls of my fortress when all of my guards were caught unawares and scrambling to comprehend what was happening? Trem adjusted his grip on the blood-soaked cloth and responded cautiously. I sensed something was wrong, and when I moved from my post to investigate, I saw the attacker climbing down into the drainage ditch outside the keep. Bull leaned in to keep Trem's eyes on his. That must have been some sixth sense or incredible vision to have made you leave your post and abandon the wall to check the culvert. Are you sure it was not something more than a feeling you had? Trem's eyes flashed such a sudden rage that both he and clearly Bull were surprised by it. If you're accusing me of being a traitor, my lord, simply say it. Bull put his hands up in contrition. Nothing of the sort, Trem. I trust you, but it is one thing to have a sense of something, quite another to feel as though one was warned in some way. That seemed to settle the matter, but Trem felt as though Bullwife Margrave had not entirely accepted his story. The half-elf made to rise, but Bull reached out and placed a hand on his uninjured shoulder, staying him with ease. Trem looked at the commander, expecting either further questions or worse, but instead Bull said, Take this for your service to me. You've committed another brave and selfless act, Trem, and for that I raise you from the rank of sword to shield of the Eagle Knights. Trem held open the bloody hand of his injured arm as Bull pressed a small rounded object into it. When Trem looked, he saw a small cloak clasp in the shape of an eagle with its wings outspread, the symbol of the Eagle Knights. I thought that I received a shield when I was raised. Isn't that the tradition? Bull settled himself back into the opposite chair with a deep sigh. Indeed, most knights are trained to the use of sword and shield, as is our doctrine. You, however, are learning to fight with only the sword, as suits your natural gifts, and so this is the sign of your progress that you will receive instead, just as I once did. Trem examined the small ornate clasp and said softly, So my reward is nothing more than a trinket, a symbolic representation of rise and rank. Bull grunted in annoyance. Do not be so quick to dismiss it, Trem. You think of a shield only as a large construction of wood and steel made with simple purpose to protect he who carries it. But a shield need not be only a piece of equipment hauled from battle to battle. When you pursued the invader in here tonight, you did so out of concern for someone other than yourself, without regard for your own safety. You were my shield in flesh and blood, and that is far more powerful than anything forged by an armorer. In a war, a stalwart ally is better than a hunk of wood in every way. Though, Bull said thoughtfully, stroking his haggard beard, perhaps it would be better for you to toil a bit longer as a sword until you truly understand the lesson you seemingly demonstrated familiarity with tonight. No. Trem pulled his hand back sharply and winced in pain as his shoulder moved with it. No, my lord, I understand the lesson. Forgive my foolishness. Bull smiled gently. Not foolishness, Trem, only youthfulness. You are forgiven, but take care to grow old enough to be responsible for knowing better the lessons of your teachers. Now, Bull rose once again and moved to his door, looking into the foyer of his quarters. Where in the name of the gods is that healer? Oi, let me in there, lad, or I'll drum your metal-coated skull off the stones. Where is he? Where is that fool boy? Barrigan burst through the doors to Bull's antechamber, red in the face and looking fiercely perturbed. 2 guards came in after him, trying to slow his progression further, while a young and nervous-looking priest brought up the rear, unsuccessfully trying to calm the dwarf. One of the guards looked up and saw Bull standing on the balcony, an amused expression on his face. Nervously, the guard tried to salute quickly while still clutching at the dwarf's flailing arms. Sorry, my liege. He became rather irate when he heard the half-elf was in need of a healer. Barrigan seemed to just notice Bull then, and he stopped his fight to move forward long enough to point accusingly, Commander Margrave, where is he? If he's not dead, I reserve rights to kill the lad before you lay a hand on his fool head. Bullwife was about to answer when Trem shuffled out of the room behind him, clutching the blood-stained cloth to his shoulder. Before he could speak, Barrigan, his face going deathly white upon seeing his friend, grabbed the confused and still half-asleep priest by the arm and yanked him forcefully up the steps at a terrific pace. Get praying to your gods, boy, and pray for yourself if they don't mend him right and fast enough. Trem tried to stave off Barrigan's tirade, but the dwarf turned his fury on the half-elf, shoving him back into Bull's room and forcing him to sit again.
Not a bloody word out of you, whelp. Not until you are fixed up, or I have to start fixing a grave for this fool of a sorcerer. Trem finally managed to speak. It's not so bad, Bergen, and he's a priest, not... You can argue semantics with me when you're not being a complete idiot, lad, and until then, sit down and keep quiet. Bull stood off to the side, chuckling quietly as the door flitted about Trem like a nursemaid. The priest's work was quick and efficient, sealing the wound and stopping the bleeding after a few moments of prayer. Trem's eyes rolled back and he slumped into the chair, exhausted from the price his body paid to seal up his injury. The healer went to assist Bergen in hoisting him off the seat, but the dwarf glared and snarled at him so fiercely the young man simply turned tail and fled back to his quarters. Lifting the unconscious Trem, Bergen made his way to the door. Bull held it open for him, remarking, "A fortunate young man to have you as his friend, Bergen Flint." "Aye," Bergen replied without making eye contact, "almost as fortunate as the man he came to protect." Bull watched them depart, the dwarf gruffly refusing the assistance of the guards at the door as he stomped down the hall. Once they were clear of the rooms and in the relative isolation of the halls of Aves, Bergen shook Trem gently and whispered in his ear, "If you can walk, it would make getting out of here easier. We need to get clear, and I want to know what in the names of all the gods happened, and away from prying ears." Trem tapped the dwarf's shoulder to signal he could walk, and with some assistance the two stumbled onward and eventually out the main doors of the keep. They took a sharp turn around to the entrance and hugged the fortress wall until they were at Bergen's cottage. The dwarf set Trem against the stone of his temporary quarters and pulled out his heavy keyring, unlocking the door and ushering the half-elf inside. As he shut it swiftly behind him, Bergen said softly, with a tone that would allow no deception, "You need to tell me what happened, Trem, on the wall and afterwards, and also what Bullwife knows. What did you tell him?" "I was going to inquire along those same lines." Separating himself from the shadows in the far corner of the one-room cottage, Thokton came forward, arms crossed. Bergen stepped immediately between the lost elf and his friend, whipping his heavy hammer off the table and holding it threateningly. "You're going to have to get through me before you have a chance at him, Elvok." Thokton did not move, his eyes looking first at Bergen and then Trem. "I simply want an explanation, same as you, dwarf. How did you know there was an assassin to be found, Trem? And what did you tell our beloved Commander Margrave?" Trem slumped into a chair and closed his eyes in semi-exhaustion before leaning forward with his elbows on the table. He looked up at Thokton and then Bergen and finally said, "It was the dream." The dwarf snorted so loudly that it brought a sharp look from Thokton. "A dream? Lad, you better come up with something more believable than that, or I'm actually going to start thinking you're helping the invaders." Thokton did not seem so skeptical, however. He stepped forward, ignoring Bergen's threatening heft of his hammer, and put his hands on the table, moving his face closer to Trem. "Tell me about your dream." Trem looked at his tutor, considering not only what to say, but how much. Then he simply let out the truth. "I was visited by the god of death, who told me that I should allow the assassin into the fortress to complete his task, to prevent a danger from some place called the Beyond." Trem shook his head as he heard the seeming insanity coming from his own mouth. "That's why I stopped Bergen when the invader first came over the wall, because Neroth told me that allowing the invaders to take Aves would unify the region and end their prejudicial authority in Dragon's Watch." Bergen was quick to interject, moving his earnest face in front of Thokton's own, but the lad went after the assassin. From what I heard, he struck back, changed his mind, saved Bullwife. Dream or no dream, he came around in the end. Thokton did not reply, but his own face was oddly contorted in an expression of both anger and concern. He pulled a chair back and seated himself. "Trem." The half-elf brought his head up and met the piercing gaze. "What else did Neroth tell you?" Trem held Thokton's eyes a moment and then said, "That you also served him, and the two had the same purpose, but there was some dispute over how to accomplish the goal." Thokton sat back and nodded to himself, drumming his fingers on the table as he looked at the walls of Bergen's quarters, thinking. Trem realized this was the first time he had seen Thokton even remotely unsure of himself, as though the veneer of dauntlessness had become somewhat thinned by the events of that night. It was odd, and more than that, it was incredibly unnerving. If this exchange Trem had had with Neroth could shake the singular and determined shell of Thokton so thoroughly, then it must mean something terrible. Bergen dropped his hammer audibly on the ground, leaning on the handle and ignoring the sharp looks he got from the other two. "Well, is that true, Elvok?" It seemed at first that Thokton might not answer, but he lowered his head slowly in concession before adding, "Yes, I and my family have served the god of death for as long as our history has been recorded. But as Trem said, my god and I have come to a disagreement over how we are to achieve our ends." He looked at the dwarf, noting the furrowed brow and fierce glare. "You can relax, Bergen Flint of Huldebarn. I am loyal to Aves. I have chosen to stand with the Eagle Knights, even if much of their belief infuriates and insults me and my kind. These invaders will be far worse lords of these lands, for as Westian men they have no love or loyalty to the people of Lagosha, and believe themselves superior." But why is Narath in support of them? Why hire this assassin to strike at Bullwife Margrave? Because, Vakhtang answered, rising from the table, the god of death does fear a greater enemy outside of this world. Only united can mortal and immortal hope to stand against it, if what little I have gleaned of the threat is true. The roots of this danger go back to the god sorcerer and the arcane wars, the horrors of which I am sure your people documented as well. The arcane wars coincided with the Huldavarn civil war, Bergen replied. We Dwarves try not to speak of the monstrosities our ancestors saw in those times. That was only just over 300 years ago, Trim interjected. Wouldn't the records of those events still be somewhat fresh? At least the accounts must have been preserved. It's not a time any dwarf likes revisiting, lad. And such is the danger, Vakhtang said, turning to look out the window of the cottage to the courtyard. The other mortal races have also tried to forget the unspeakable things that were brought forth in those days, and in doing so we have all become unguarded against such an event happening once more. But to murder the commander of Aves and sack the fortress, just so the regions around her may fall under one ruler and vision to stand united against a barely understood danger, even I cannot agree with such a drastic action. What did Narath mean, then, when he said you had a different plan? Trem asked. Vakhtang looked at the half-elf over his shoulder and said softly, I would rather see the people of Tethtanir find cause to unite without conquest or violence, so as to save the lives of so many who are not soldiers from the whips and chains of war. Vakhtang turned back to the window once more and shook his head, though perhaps it is my own foolishness and weakness that leads me to believe so. There was silence as the three considered the oddities of the evening. Then Bergen turned to Trem and said, What did you tell Bullwife? Trem sighed, partially from exhaustion at the events from the evening, and partially from the strain of having to process what it all meant. I told him I had an eerie feeling, that I saw an intruder enter the drainage ditch into the sealed culvert and gave chase. Bergen seemed satisfied, but Vakhtang turned from the window with a slight smirk, saying, But you actually led him over the wall you were guarding, yes? As Narath asked you to. Bergen made as though to argue with Vakhtang in Trem's defense, but a look from the lost elf silenced him. I do not judge either choice, Trem, but I am curious why you let him over initially, and then changed your mind. Trem looked at the other two, his face suggesting that he himself might not have considered why he had done what he did. Then, in a flash of understanding, he said, Narath told me that by letting the assassin in, I was proving that I was in service to no one but myself. It occurred to me after the intruder fled the wall that I was really just following someone else's orders again, Narath's, and Bergen drove the point home as well. Maybe Narath and you, Vakhtang, are right about Bullwife. Maybe he holds no love for those of us who are not human, just as his predecessors have before him. Maybe I am a shield now only because he is desperate for fighters and he needs me. But regardless, I believe more in Aves than I do in the invaders. I've seen what the army of the Lion leaves in its wake. I don't wish that on Aves. Bergen looked at Vakhtang to see if the reply satisfied him, but the lost elf's face betrayed nothing. The man who had taken it upon himself to train Trem considered the half-elf for a long time, then spun to the door. As he turned the handle, he said, All armies leave ruin, Trem Waterhound. Make no mistake. But your answer satisfies me. I was not aware Bullwife had promoted you once again. We shall have to increase the intensity of your training. Meet me 1 hour after sunrise tomorrow and we can begin again. Vakhtang was gone before Trem could reply. The door closed firmly behind him and Bergen slid the slide bolt with a snort of annoyance. He turned to Trem and his face softened when he saw how exhausted his friend was. Take my bed. I'll stay up a while and keep watch. They replaced you on the wall, so no need to go there tonight. It sounds like you'll be needing your rest. Trem did not argue. Stumbling from the table to Bergen's bed in the corner, he slumped on the heavy furs, still fully dressed and armed, and was soon asleep. Bergen kept his word, watching out the window for any unwelcome guests and thumbing the handle of his hammer. He looked at Trem now and again, considering what he had learned about the half-elf that evening. Bergen had not pegged the boy as someone who might be so easily swayed, and in fairness he had stuck to Bullwife when push came to shove, but it had been a close thing, and perhaps more troubling to Bergen, the dwarf had allowed it to happen. The heir to the Prince of Stone shuddered slightly and pushed the thought from his mind. He was too dark to think of such things, and in truth, he doubted the light of day would make them any easier to consider. So, long episode, but that is the first section, the intro about book 1, and then the prologue for book 2. So this will pick up again on Thursday at 3 o'clock. It probably will not be as long of an episode. An hour and a half is a lot for me, and you can tell my voice is already kind of gone. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's @Legacy Chronicle. You can also find me on Facebook if you search for the Legacy Chronicle. I take direct orders there for books, and we now have T-shirts, and there will be more artwork coming from the esteemed Sarah Fensor soon, which I've put a preview up, I believe, as the current banner for this page, so you can see some of what she's been working on.
Additionally, if you prefer digital copies, you can get the book in Kindle on Amazon. If you just go to Amazon and search for T.H. Paul Legacy Chronicle, that'll pop up. You can also buy the paperbacks directly from Amazon if you want to, too. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, there will be audiobooks coming, starting with a short story, and then later, both book 1 and book 2, as fast as we can kind of turn them out at a high quality. So, thank you for listening. Hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the week, and I will see people in a couple days on Thursday.